Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if you're. Oh no, it is afternoon now if you're calling in from WA. Look, thank you all for attending virtually today. Let me begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the different lands on which we all meet today. I'd also like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people present today. I just wanted to quickly introduce Luke Bosher, who some of you may have already met. Luke comes out of Victorian Government. He was a senior official in Victorian Government, and we're very, very lucky to have him working now for Housing Australia. And Luke will be heading up our program strategy as we move forward with the HAFFF and the Accord program. And Luke will help me today in terms of the presentation as we sort of step through the various parts. As you can see here, the rough agenda that we have in mind, we have a bit of a program recap. I'll talk to a little bit of the objectives and some of the key aspects of feedback, and then Luke will also jump in around the feedback and other considerations that he'll talk to. And then we'll have a Q&A session where we're keen to sort of take your questions. We'll try our best to answer as many as we possibly can today. But if we can't get there, then we'll seek to take them on notice. And there is the Q&A function that's been operating through the portal since the scheme opened on the 15th of January. So just a couple of aspects that I wanted to just zero in on, maybe just starting with the objectives of the scheme. If that's okay, thanks, Luke, or whoever's driving the bus. If we could just jump ahead to the program recap, funding round one. Thank you. So look, just touching on some of the objectives, and certainly when you have a look at the call for application document, you'll see that the government's objectives have been sort of stated in that document, and the investment mandate, which also sits as sort of a document above or has informed the call for application documents. So obviously, sort of, there's a focus on 40,000 social and affordable. There is a very strong desire to improve housing affordability, particularly for those on lower incomes through this initiative. There are obviously broader government initiatives that are underway at the moment, but the 40,000 focus on social and affordable is obviously very important. It's not just about sort of the provision of housing. It's also about, some of the other objectives that the government has in mind in terms of getting the spread of projects across geographies, across cohorts. And also it's important too that where we build properties, that we also sort of enable that's close to infrastructure where possible. I know that's not always the case, particularly in remote areas. But we're sort of taking into consideration sort of amenity and livability considerations when we're looking at the spread of housing across Australia. Investment. So one of the key aspects of the government scheme is also to try and promote investment from other sources. So when we have a look at, say, overseas experience, when you have a look at very sizable social and affordable or subsidised housing, typically what you see is substantial support from private sources. And I think, part of this model, the availability payment model, which I'll talk to in a second, is looking at ways that we can try and leverage in various sources of finance, whether that be from government, from private sector, from state, from local government, into this sector. Value for money, that encompasses a range of things, not just cost. Certainly cost is an important consideration, but there's a range of other factors that are important in making that determination, as I mentioned before, such as geography, having a balance in terms of looking across cohorts. The government has articulated a number of objectives that they have with this program, which includes, for example, 4,000 places being set aside for victims of domestic violence and all people over 55 at risk of homelessness. And there's also a strong emphasis on also supporting Indigenous housing. In terms of complementarity, one of the important things for us is there are a number of existing programs that are operating at the moment across jurisdictions. So we do think it's important that we also have some degree of complementarity with those other programs. And certainly when if applicants put forward proposals, we'd certainly encourage applicants to look at other forms of financing, because that would then influence the amount of availability payment that you require through this process. And if you can reduce the availability payment, by definition, that would make your project more competitive. So, look, I just wanted to spend a bit of time quickly focusing on those aspects, that we think, have been sort of the focus of interest to date, and just talk a little bit more about the availability payment, how that's going to work, what that means in practice, but then also talk about no interest loans. Next slide, please. So the concessional loans is something that I thought worth emphasising. When you have a look at the eligible applicants, states and territories, local government, charities, including Indigenous organisations focused on improving housing outcomes, registered community housing providers, among others. There's been this feedback that we've had that, when you're putting together a financing stack to support housing, one of the important pieces of that arrangement relates to having sufficient equity or equity-like finance in the project. So responding to that feedback, government has decided to offer essentially concessional loans, as it says there on the slide. And we're offering, as part of that government decision, we're offering no interest loans, which is restricted to the charitable entities that I've mentioned before, to help make the capital stack work in order to deliver or buy dwellings. We expect this to be generally around 10% of the project costs. However, in some circumstances where more financial support is required, including for applicants with less than 75 dwellings across their applications, or in the case of regional projects, less than 150 dwellings, the no interest loan can be as high as 30% of the project cost. The other type of funding, or another type of funding that's available, is availability payments, which is essentially which all eligible applicants can apply for. Availability payments are an ongoing government-backed income source to help close the gap between the commercial cost of buying or developing and operating housing and the revenues received through rent and Commonwealth rent assistance. It is up to applicants to determine the quantum of availability payments they will need in their project. The amount will naturally be different for social and affordable housing, which applicants can describe in their application. Due to the competitive nature of the funding process, efficiency of funding is important to us. This doesn't always mean the lowest cost. It means the best value for money having regard to other things like the type of dwelling, the area, the proposed resident cohort, and the housing need. All of the costs and revenues in a project, including the proposed availability payment and concessional loan, will need to be reflected in a financial model as part of an application. A pro forma financial model has been provided in the Housing Australia portal. Hopefully most of you are familiar with the portal that has been established to support the HAFFF and the NHAF process. But I'm very happy to come back to the portal if there's further questions around its operation. So this model can be used for guidance, used by applicants when submitting their application, or they can use their own financial model. Ultimately, Housing Australia is interested in achieving value for money and an efficient funding outcome. Applicants who are successful will be paid the availability payment quarterly over a 25-year term, which will be indexed annually, provided that dwellings are continually made available for social or affordable housing. Applicants will need to determine the rest of the capital stack and sources of funding and finance for the project themselves. Excuse me. I just wanted to also emphasise that while the availability payment is the primary source of financial structuring, we do appreciate that there may be some circumstances where a sort of upfront capital grant might be more applicable. Now, this would given the nature of the model that has been set up, we would encourage applicants to submit a sort of application on the basis that you are applying for availability payment, but we're certainly sort of open to the idea of having a look at those particular applications that have been submitted, and then sort of seeing if that particular project may lend itself to an upfront capital grant. And I guess as an example, we understand and appreciate that, for example, remote housing, the availability payment model might be difficult, and it might be difficult to leverage private capital. So that's something that we're happy to consider once we see the projects and whether there's an argument to take that approach in terms of upfront capital grants. In addition, there's also the bond aggregator, which you may be familiar with. So that has been operating for the last 5.5 years by formerly NHAF, now Housing Australia. And if you're a registered CHP, you are eligible for applying for the bond aggregator, which provides senior debt. These program-specific loans will be offered on terms that should allow the availability payments to maximise the efficacy of the senior debt component of the capital stack for projects. The terms and conditions of these loans are predetermined with standardised inclusions and standardised documentation. Applications for Housing Australia senior debt supporting HAFFF and NHAF projects have the same opening and closing dates as the other funding sources. However, I'd also like to note that applications for senior debt will be processed and assessed by a team separate from the HAFFF and NHAF program team, and that the senior debt process is separate and independent to the decisioning of program applications. So just to clarify, there's essentially three sources. There's the concessional loan, which is sort of like the equity-like piece of a financing stack. There's the availability payments, which are essentially what you're bidding in for through the HAFF or the Accord application process. And then separately, if you wanted to apply for senior debt from Housing Australia, there's a process that enables you to do so. Now, all of that information and the application process is available on our portal. Just quickly sort of running through some of the sort of other key characteristics of the model. Funding is provided for 25 years. After 25 years, the availability payments will stop. If you're a charitable entity with a no-interest loan, the loan will become repayable in full. This can be funded by selling the property, refinancing with another lender, or potentially some other means. The dwellings may be retained or they may be sold. If they are retained for use other than social affordable housing, or if they are sold, we expect to see the interests of the tenants are looked after, and also that there is an ongoing financial benefit retained within the social and affordable system, for example, through financial benefits to a charitable housing entity or through ongoing reinvestment and supply. And this is certainly an issue that we've had a lot of feedback on, and we are expecting to come back with further clarification to the market in the very near term. In terms of delivery models, Luke, are you happy for me to keep going through this section? Yep. So then for delivery models, look, we anticipate there's going to be a range of different delivery and commercial structure that we see as fitting within the parameters of the program. It's certainly possible for eligible applicants to buy new dwellings that are either off the plan or already completed. For example, a registered CHP enters into a contract with a developer or CHO, depending on where you live, with a developer to purchase a number of dwellings that the CHP will then use for social and or affordable housing. That CHP might apply for a concessional loan to assist with the purchase price and apply for availability payments to subsidise the ongoing operational costs for 25 years. It is also possible for eligible applicants to deliver dwellings themselves. In that case, a CHP might apply for a concessional loan, or a charitable entity might apply for a concessional loan to assist with construction costs and also availability payments to subsidise operations. Another example could be partnering with a state or local government, where they may be sort of providing land, or a developer partner, for housing to be delivered. And then the CHP either retains freehold or leasehold interest in the dwellings and applies for availability payments to subsidise operations for the social and affordable dwellings. In terms of the evaluation process, there's some key requirements that have been highlighted in the call for application documentation. So this gives you a sense of what we'll be looking at when applications come through. Key thing obviously is to be an eligible applicant and that the project is compliant with the specified requirements. You'll need to demonstrate that the project is financially feasible, funding sources are identified and the capital structure is optimised. Need to demonstrate that the project achieves Housing Australia's policy and program requirements. For example, it meets housing need and is well located and well designed. Need to outline the approach to managing planning and construction risk, demonstrate that the dwellings can be delivered on time and that the 25-year tenancy and asset management strategy is sound. Need to be able to demonstrate the experience and capability of the relevant project participants. And finally, need to satisfy Housing Australia that the commercial structure is appropriate, indicate the acceptance of the commercial and risk framework, and demonstrate how the value of the government's investment will be retained in the social and affordable housing system in the long term. Luke, am I handing over to you at this point?
Excellent. Thanks very much, Nathan. So good to meet people. Luke Bosher from Housing Australia. I head up our program strategy area, including Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing. And can I also just acknowledge I'm joining from Wurundjeri country here in Melbourne and acknowledge the traditional owners of the land I'm joining from. So as Nathan mentioned, this session we put together as a specific and dedicated session around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing in this funding round. So Nathan's kind of set out the overall kind of approach to the program and how it's structured and the opportunity in round one. And now I just wanted to delve a little bit more into some of the issues that are particular to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers. So Nathan kind of talked through the different funding that's available through the program. And this just kind of reiterates that, and particularly for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers. So, it's a big, opportunity and difference in this program that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers can apply whether or not they're a registered community housing provider. So that's an intentional decision to enable a greater opportunity for the Aboriginal-led sector to be able to apply directly for funding. We know that some organisations are on a pathway to registration at a point in the future, and hopefully this will help people along that pathway. Some organisations have decided not to become registered as a CHP. They'll also be eligible for funding, and obviously registered CHPs who are also Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations can apply. So the concessional loan that Nathan talked through and the availability payments are both available to anyone that is eligible as an Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing provider under this category. The affordable housing bond aggregator is only available to community housing providers. So that's kind of where the difference comes in for organisations that might be thinking of applying. If you are a registered CHP, an Aboriginal CHP, you can apply for the concessional loan, the availability payment, and also the bond aggregator, senior debt. And if you are an Aboriginal housing provider but not a registered CHP, you can apply for the concessional loan and the availability payment. So just wanted to kind of make that clear in those materials. I guess some of the other issues that we thought and had heard were coming up from the sector on the next slide are really kind of about the portfolio overall of what we're looking to achieve in these 40,000 homes. So we've got a commitment that will deliver 1,200 homes, or work towards delivering 1,200 homes across each state and territory. That commitment's particularly relevant in some of the smaller jurisdictions like the NT and the ACT and Tasmania. So have been having a number of conversations with the sector in the NT and the NT government about how we can work together to deliver that commitment, given that's a really substantial number in the NT, and we're really keen to make sure that we work with the sector to make sure that that's possible to achieve. Our investment mandate says that we need to consider how what we're funding is equitable on an as needs basis across Australia, including making sure that we deliver across regional, rural and remote. So we absolutely expect that across these 40,000 homes, we're going to be funding housing in all types of geographies, in metro, regional and remote. In the first year, this round is really focused on projects that are pretty ready to get going, that have either already completed construction or will commence in the next 18 months. So they're pretty, ready projects to go. That means that, a particular set of projects are more likely to be able to get up in this first round. So if we do see an imbalance in where we're funding projects and for which cohorts, we expect that over time we'll be getting the procurement to adjust to make sure that we are delivering for all of the cohorts and all the geographies that we need to across the country. And we've made a particular commitment around Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing, that we're working with the sector, with NHAF, with the state peaks, and with the sector more broadly, to get feedback on this first funding round, look at what worked for the sector, look at what were the challenges, and look at how we can improve future rounds to make sure that the funding that we're deploying is able to be used by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander housing providers. So I guess it's a bit of kind of specific kind of context and issues that are coming up when we have been talking with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers throughout this round. On the next slide are some of the more general issues that we've seen kind of come up across our engagement more generally. So one of the issues that's come up quite a bit is around the Federal Safety Commissioner. So there's a requirement that some types of development that we fund are undertaken by organisations, builders that are registered with the Federal Safety Commissioner. And we've kind of heard that's a particular issue in smaller jurisdictions and in some regional areas. And we're working hard with our Commonwealth colleagues to get some more clarity out to the sector through a guidance note, which we intend to publish in the coming week or so. And we are working with our Commonwealth colleagues because these requirements aren't Housing Australia requirements. They're requirements that are set out in Commonwealth legislation and regulation. And so today what we wanted to do is just provide a bit of clarity on where the Federal Safety Commissioner requirements do not apply and that registration is not required. So those circumstances where registration is not required is where we're funding a recipient after construction is already complete, where we're funding a recipient for building work under a contract that's been entered into by an unaccredited builder, but where that builder is in a joint venture with an accredited builder, subject to the OFSC approval. Funding a recipient for construction of single dwelling houses, regardless of the number of dwellings that are involved in the project, where we're providing acquisition finance, so post-construction finance to purchase completed dwellings, where we haven't had involvement and the recipient hasn't had involvement in the building work, and also providing takeout finance, that is financing that's provided post-construction to refinance other borrowings by the recipient, and was used in funding the building work, as the building work's already been completed using a third party's funding. So there's 5 scenarios where we don't think the advice is clear that the Federal Safety Commissioner registration is not required. And so hopefully that provides a bit of certainty for people that this has been an issue for. We know there's other scenarios that aren't in that list. And as we mentioned, we'll be providing a guidance note in the coming week or so that hopefully will address some of those other scenarios. One of the other questions that's been coming through is about project readiness and how much certainty is needed for projects to be put in this funding round. So there's 2 parts of the CFA that kind of talk to how ready a project needs to be. And one of those is the funding parameters, where we've said that you're only eligible to apply for projects that can commence construction no later than 18 months after the funding's committed, or that have already been completed. And the other part of the CFA that deals with project readiness is about the evaluation criteria that we'll be using around project delivery. And one of those criteria is about the level of certainty that the project is going to be delivered, including the level of planning risk. So some of the questions we've got are, does that mean that only DA-approved projects can be submitted? And the answer to that is no. Applications can include projects that aren't yet DA-approved. The CFA allows for all projects, for projects at all stages of readiness to come forward, but we will be looking at the level of risk that the project may experience in the planning process if it's not yet approved. So, just want to be clear, we encourage you to put in applications for projects even if they don't have a DA, and you just obviously need to address the evaluation criteria around the level of certainty that the project will proceed, including any planning risk. One of the questions that's come up a bit, and maybe it's relevant to an extent here, but maybe not in other cases, is around special purpose vehicles. We had a number of questions for how special purpose vehicles can be formed and how are they involved in the round. The way that special purpose vehicles work in this funding round is that they need to have one of the eligible charitable entities in the program, which could be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers, registered CHPs, or a veterans organisation. And what we're looking, I guess the purpose of that is really around enabling the eligible charitable entities to be able to access capital and capability and resources that they need to be able to deliver at scale. And so this allows people to enter into a partnership with an organisation that wouldn't otherwise be eligible to apply for funding. So that could be an institutional investor or a builder or developer. But in doing that, we've got a requirement that the charitable entity has meaningful participation in the SPV. And so some of the things that we'll be using to assess meaningful or genuine participation are things like the charitable entity's role in how the SPV is governed and its board, where the assets go in a wind-up or at the conclusion of the funding term. So like our goal in the program is really to build the capability and balance sheet of the charitable housing sector. And it's for that reason that we're allowing CHPs and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers to partner with others in an SPV, but we also just want to see meaningful participation and benefit out of that SPV. One of the other questions that we've got is about kind of how the financing kind of stacks together to make a project work in this program. And I think that's probably relevant to talk about a little bit here. As Nathan said, we've got different funding available. We've got the concessional loan, the affordable housing bond aggregator for registered CHPs, as well as the concessional loan. And so if you think about how these things kind of work together for CHPs and other charitable providers, where we would kind of be looking at a model, for example, or expect to see kind of models, for example, with a split of kind of 10% of the project being an equity contribution, 20% from the organisation that's applying, 20% of capital from other sources, and then say 70% or so of the project being debt, either from Housing Australia or from a bank lender. But in the program, we've got the concessional loan available, and that concessional loan could replace the 10% equity contribution from the organisation, and it goes up to 30% in regional areas and for other cohorts in particular circumstances. So if you apply for the concessional loan up to 30%, that can kind of substitute for the equity from the organisation and capital from other sources. And so that, together with kind of senior debt, either from us or from a bank lender, can kind of make the whole project kind of stack up together. And then the availability payments that we offer are then the way to meet the cost of the debt that's taken out on the project. And obviously for projects that have kind of government contributions in the form of land provided on a long-term lease or on a transfer, or potentially from land councils, traditional owner organisations, or ACOs themselves, obviously that kind of contribution of land into the project makes the availability payment lower than it otherwise would be, and a more competitive application in this process. A couple of the other questions that we've got are probably slightly less particular to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers. State and local governments are keen to contribute land. We've had questions from the states and local government about how best to make that contribution. And we're talking with states about how they can participate in the round. We're really keen to see states participate and really keen to see co-contributions from state and local government together with CHPs and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander organisations to make projects stack up. And we've also had quite a few questions from local governments about how can local governments best be involved in the program. And again, we're really encouraging local governments to partner with CHPs, with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander providers to sell or lease land to make projects really stack up and work well for particular cohorts, and expect to kind of work more with local governments over time to see how their land can best be contributed into future funding rounds. So there are a few of the kind of key issues that have been coming up generally. I now just wanted to turn pretty briefly to some of the feedback we got on the funding documentation. So maybe just while I'm doing that, I also just wanted to do a quick plug for questions. Part of the benefit for today was having an opportunity to talk about some of the specific issues for the sector and some of the questions that have been coming up. But it's also an opportunity for you to ask us questions that are on your mind about this funding round and how it's working for you. So if you do have a question that you'd like us to answer today, you can ask questions using the online platform. So if you press the 3 dots in the bottom of your screen, click on info and then click on ask a question. Question will come through to us. And we've got time in our session today to be able to answer questions that come up from people. So really encourage you, if there's things you're not clear about, questions you've got, feel free to pop them in the app and we'll get to them today. The next issue that we just want to talk to before we get to questions is about the Framework Funding Agreement. If we go to the next slide. So at the end of December, towards the end of December, we published for consultation our Framework Funding Agreements. The purpose of publishing it was to make sure that we'd heard feedback from applicants and peak bodies around getting these funding documents right. We want them to work for organisations. We want them to be successful. We also have a large number of projects we expect to contract pretty quickly and at scale. And so we want a pretty standard set of documents and agreements that all entities can enter into. And so for that reason, we published them, got a bunch of feedback, including from some people on this call. So just want to mention a couple of the key themes of feedback that we've received. So some of those themes of feedback were around managing risks and time and delay during the development phase, how the income eligibility requirements operate over the 25-year term for affordable housing, in particular when people's incomes change. And that's an issue that we expect to be able to come back pretty soon and clarify with people how that will work. We got some feedback around the way availability payments work when there's vacancies and how dwelling availability requirements work. We got some questions around end-of-term obligations, so particularly what organisations needed to do with respect to the tenant's ongoing accommodation when the 25 years of availability payments and concessional loans come to an end. It's a few kind of technical legal things that came up about default termination, changes of control. There were some kind of financial questions about security and what security Housing Australia would want for availability payments and concessional loans, and how we would work with other lenders into projects that we're coming back with some more clarity on, and some kind of draft agreements between Housing Australia and other creditors. We already talked about work health and safety. We got a few questions about how portfolios of projects work, both how people can apply with a portfolio of projects, and also when people are successful and have a portfolio, how we contract a whole portfolio and how interrelated the portfolio is. We'll come out with some clarification on that too. And and just some kind of general kind of ease of use feedback about the contractual framework. So there's a specific session on Monday next week to talk through the feedback and how that's being translated into the final documents. What we wanted to do today was to give you a sense of these themes and give you a sense of how we were responding to them. But next week in the Monday session, we'll be talking through in much more detail about exactly how we're responding to each of those. And we expect to publish that final framework funding agreement and the tripartite financiers deed in the next couple of weeks. So if you haven't registered already and are interested, you can use the Rego link that you used for today to register for Monday's session on the funding agreements. So in terms of next steps from here, I don't think anything on this slide will be a surprise for people. The round's been open for a few weeks now, having opened on the 15th. We had a session earlier last week on the financial returnable schedules. You can download it and look at it on the Housing Australia portal. We've got the session on Monday that I mentioned on framework funding agreements. You can ask questions up until the 15th of March, and then the funding round closes on the 22nd of March. And we're working towards being able to make a decision on applications in kind of June, July, with the anticipation that we'd be able to have notified successful applicants and engaged with people significantly on the next steps by the end of Q3 this year. So the round will have been open for kind of 10 weeks or so, and then we expect to spend about the same amount of time working through evaluation and then get back to people pretty quickly after that. So that's our kind of run through of things that we were keen to share with you. And now we're keen to kind of get into questions that people have submitted and issues that are kind of on people's minds. Nathan, maybe can I direct a question your way? One of the questions is about how do we expect that we're going to be working with organisations post the first funding round to address some of the, the feedback and issues that have come through in the first funding round?
Yeah, so thanks, Luke, and thanks for the question. Look, I think there's a couple of dimensions to that. So first of all, in terms of the consultation that we've been having through the initial information sessions, through the Q&A portal, and then also the consultation process that we had on the funding documents, we are sort of looking to issue updated frequently asked questions, and we are coming back with answers to the Q&As. And then we do anticipate that we'd have the final funding documents hopefully available later this week, and then that information session that Luke was referring to next Friday to talk through what that final version looks like. In addition, after this first round, the idea is to have a bit of a review in terms of how the round went. What are the learnings? What are the things that we've done well? What are the things that need to be improved? And then that would inform, subsequent rounds in terms of, how we move forward. Certainly, there's a lot of objectives that government have articulated that obviously we need to hit over the 5-year period. I think for year one, the overwhelming focus is trying to, demonstrate the concept that it does work in terms of the model, in terms of delivering that supply target, which is that sort of 40,000 over 5 years. But we do anticipate that, we'd need to make further refinements as we sort of gather information and feedback from market participants. But yeah, certainly the expectation is we'll need to make refinements. Now, what that means in terms of future procurement processes, grant processes, we'll have to sort of see what that feedback is, and obviously would also need to get further guidance from government. I think just in terms of in the Indigenous housing space, obviously we're very keen to try and provide all the necessary support we can to try and encourage applications to come forward in this round. We do appreciate that not everyone, not just in the Indigenous housing space, but more broadly, that not everyone is necessarily going to be ready in this first round. So then what are the things that we can do to then lay the foundations for subsequent rounds? So that way we can try and work with the sector and individual organisations to try and work towards submitting applications in subsequent rounds, and obviously trying to maximise the prospect of success. Does that help, Luke?
That's great. Thanks very much, Nathan. And look, certainly we're really looking forward to talking more with the sector about feedback from this round. So look forward to having those conversations pretty soon after this round closes. I guess another question that's come through is about the concessional loan, and we've said that the concessional loan can be for up to 10% of the project, but in some circumstances it could be up to 30%. And the question is, in what circumstances can the concessional loan go up to 30% of the project? So the circumstances where the concessional loan can be up to 30% of the value of the project are where the total number of dwellings that are being proposed from the applicant across all the projects that they're applying for in the round is less than 75 dwellings across all their different applications. However, we've got a higher threshold for that in regional, rural and remote areas. So organisations can apply for up to 30% as a concessional loan if their total number of dwellings across all their projects is less than 150. So that's kind of allowing people to really kind of use that concessional loan even further in rural, regional and remote areas. And part of that also recognises that they can be more challenging areas to deliver projects, and that some of the other financing challenges are tricky for getting institutional capital to invest in some of those rural and remote areas. So there's a more generous threshold there, which hopefully will help some organisations on the call. And we're also looking for organisations to explain, the kind of case for why that higher amount is needed. For example, addressing the needs of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So they're the circumstances where you can apply for that higher amount of concessional loan, up to 30%. Another question that's come through is about how Housing Australia is working with states and territories to get them to engage in the program. So I might take this and Nathan might want to add to it. So there's a few different ways. One is obviously states and territories can be direct applicants in and of themselves for housing that they end up owning and operating. States and territories can also apply for housing where they might be the applicant originally because it's a state government site, but are looking to transfer that across to the community housing or Aboriginal housing sector. So they can kind of apply directly for funding for projects that are kind of ones that they might originate and then look to transfer to the sector, which I think can be a helpful pathway where organisations might have less development capability, but might be able to partner either with the state housing agency or with a kind of economic development, land development agency in their jurisdiction. And certainly that's an avenue that we're seeing a number of Aboriginal housing providers talking with kind of state development agencies about whether there's opportunities for them to take some of the stock that are being developed by state development agencies. I guess the other ways that we're talking with the states are where there's opportunities for state and Housing Australia funding to be more aligned together to get outcomes where the sector think that the state is able to play an important role in kind of helping the sector access funding. And so we've been having some of those conversations with the states. We've been having some of those conversations with the Aboriginal housing sector about where they think there's opportunities for our funding sources and state funding sources to align kind of together, where those pretty early stage discussions, but that's the other way that we're engaging state and territory governments. Anything you want to add on states, Nathan?
Oh, look, that was really comprehensive. I think the only thing I'd say is that, and this applies to community housing providers more generally, but I guess being the first round, my sense is that some of the states and territories are probably still cranking up in terms of, how they can participate in the program. So what that means in practice, that in some cases, the state has indicated they want to partner, with Indigenous Housing Group or a CHP, but they haven't gone through the process yet of, narrowing down that preferred partner. So one of the things that we're looking at the moment is ways that we can try and get the state or territory to submit applications on the assumption that it will be in partnership with a CHP or an Indigenous housing group, but then sort of finalising the information or firming up the information at a later stage. So we're just working through what that looks like in practice. But I think we'll have some sort of further clarity around that, hopefully in the very near future. We are trying to sort of encourage their participation as much as possible, not just from a sort of funding perspective, but obviously given that they're obviously very close to a number of projects and have better information than what we do in terms of what's happening on the ground and where things, or where housing in particular, is needed. So we're sort of keen to involve them for a number of reasons to ensure the efficient rollout of the program.
Great, thank you. And we're kind of getting towards time, so this might be the last question for now. But there's also a question about, we've talked about 1,200 properties per state and territory. Is there a target by state and territory or overall of the number of homes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians? I mentioned earlier that the investment mandate requires that we look at an equitable distribution of housing based on need across the country. So that's the key kind of driver for Housing Australia, to think about making sure that there is housing dispersed across the country and that also it goes to groups who need it. Obviously, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians are one of those groups. In the call for applications, we've kind of explained how we go about doing the evaluation of these projects that come in. And one of the parts of the evaluation is looking at what we're calling the kind of portfolio mix and portfolio parameters. So looking at what the different requirements are to make sure we are working towards that objective of an equitable distribution based on need. One of the things we'll be looking at is making sure that we're doing our best to fund projects that come in for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Australians. And in that, we've said that we would expect that over time we would be funding housing for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders that is at least equal to their population across Australia. So, that sets a bit of a benchmark of what we're working towards over time. It doesn't set a ceiling. It's really just kind of saying that is at least what we want to be achieving in the program. So we'll do our best to do that in the first round based on what comes in. And as Nathan said, we're keen to work with people post the first round about how we can best get this right so that we can achieve more housing outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. So I think that brings us to the end for today. Can I just say a big thank you to everyone who's made time to join the session today, and thanks for engaging in this session. Hopefully you found it useful in putting together your application and understanding more about this funding round. The Housing Australia portal is the key place to get more information. It has the call for applications document and all the returnable schedules. It also has a Q&A functionality. So if you have questions that weren't addressed today or additional things you want to ask over the next couple of weeks, please do jump onto the portal, ask it through the Q&A function, and we'll respond through the published Q&As on the website. Thanks again for joining us, and best of luck in preparing your applications for this funding round. Thanks very much.